What does it mean that there is no self? In this lecture video, I'm going to be looking at, in general, the Buddhist argument for why there is no self. There is no you. You're a conceptual fiction. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at Vasubandhu's refutation of the theory of a self. So to begin, Vasubandhu lays out the possibilities. Now, either in general, right, there is a self or there's not a self. If there is a self, right, someone that is substantially or ultimately real, at the end of this lecture video, it'll make sense what the difference is between ultimate and conventional truth. But if a person is substantially or ultimately real in the sense that they exist and subsist over time, and really, in this sense, are therefore permanent, an unchanging, real, essential entity, then, Vasubandhu says, they must be a distinct entity from the aggregates. What are the aggregates? The aggregates are the basic five-part makeup of the existence of a human being, of the different things that make up what a human being is. These were widely accepted in classical India. They consist of first corporeality, or bodily forms. So if we wanted to talk about the aggregates that make up a self, this would be my body, right? My hair, all these tangible things we can touch and so on. Second would be feeling, right? So just basic sensation, right? So, but not just feeling in the sense of only that one sense of feeling, but taste, touch, sight, and so on. Feeling also could involve a kind of mental awareness of things, feeling sad or so on. Then there's judgment, the aggregate of judgment. So this is, or otherwise known as perception or discrimination, where we conceptually mark out things in the world. So based on our sense impressions, we might say, we then make judgments based on them, such that we like something, we don't like something. Something is red, something is white. Something is beautiful, something is ugly, and so on and so forth. Right? Something is one, something is two. Something's a cup, another thing is something else, right? Volition is kind of, you can think of like desire, so a movement towards something, right? That kind of makes us want to judge something or feel something or whatever else. Consciousness then is just an awareness of, right, volition, an awareness of our judgment or whatever else, right? Now you might think, I welcome you to challenge. Maybe you think that there are more than just these five aggregates, but it was generally agreed upon in classical India that when we talk about the self, when we talk about personhood, it consists of no more than these five things. Now, Vasubandhu is saying a person, right, if there's a real you, it can't be something of the aggregates, right? A person cannot be ultimately real if they are one or more of the aggregates, since all these aggregates are impermanent and they're causally conditioned, right? So we couldn't say that you are your body because we can cut off your arm and you would still exist. We can't say you are feeling because you can lose sight and yet you could still be you, of course. Judgment, it wouldn't just be judgment. Sometimes our judgment changes over time, yet we conventionally say we're still our same selves. Same thing with volition and consciousness, especially consciousness. When we go to sleep, we lose consciousness, right? Yet we're still ourselves when we wake up. Or we're still ourselves, I guess we would say, right? It's not like once we go to sleep, then someone can do whatever they want with us because we're no longer us, right? We don't conventionally recognize these things. So we cannot talk about the self as being merely the aggregates themselves. So there are two possible explanations for what the self is if the self is substantially real. The first is that if the self is causally conditioned, right? So this is the first account, that the self is causally conditioned. There is a real self, but it's causally conditioned. If this is the case, then Vasubandhu says there must be an explanation for the existence of this causally conditioned self in relation to its causal conditions. If, however, the self is ultimately real and it is causally unconditioned, so it does not rely in any way on the aggregates, then the explanation for its existence is not dependent on its relation to causal conditions. Now, the other general possibility considering the existence of the self is that there is no self. Now, this is ultimately what we're going to see Vasubandhu is going to argue for. That, he says, if by analysis, so if when we conceptually investigate something like the idea of a self, if through this investigation a person or a self is shown to be a collection of substances and nothing more, right, and really causally conditioned substances, then they are conceptually real or merely conventionally real, but they're not ultimately real, right? So basically we can, for all intents and purposes, we can practically say there's a self, but there is no real self there. So we'll get to all that. We're going to consider the first possibility, then the second, and then ultimately we'll see how both of these have problems and why Vasubandhu is going to argue for the last account here, that when the concept of self is put under analysis, there is no self there. Now, the Pudgalavadins were these Buddhists that thought that there was a conception of a self, so they're kind of unorthodox Buddhists. And they put forward this idea that there is a self that is not distinct from the aggregates, so not like a soul, but instead there's a self that is causally conditioned by the aggregates. So there is something that is not permanent, but there is a self, almost very similar, in fact, to John Locke's argument. So there's a self that's causally conditioned by the aggregates, insofar as it is when these aggregates exist that the self exists. They argue for this on the basis of two theses. So they say a person is conceived in reliance upon a collection of aggregates in the sense that a person, one, cannot, although perceived, be conceived on the basis of being perceived. In other words, a person, although we can see them, is not understood to be a person on the basis of merely seeing them. So it's not just that we see a person, therefore we know that there's a person. Because, of course, we change over time. But we, of course, do, they want to say, rely on our perception of beings to say there is a self there. And two, a person must be conceived in dependence upon a collection of aggregates, at least some of which are present when they are perceived. That when we say we perceive a person there, it is always because the aggregates in some way or another are there. So maybe, right, you don't have hearing, but you have feeling. Or you're unconscious, so you don't have consciousness, but we still recognize you're this person. Or again, right, you lose your hair, but we still recognize you're the same person, and so on, right? So in some way or another, when we do perceive a person, it's not that we perceive the actual person, but we have this understanding that we perceive a person that is always perceived, or always, with perception being a means, right, through perception, we conceive of a person always when aggregates are there. So they're dependent on the aggregates. Now, they liken this, right, this is a common, again, metaphor used by classical Buddhists to talk about fire. And they say a person is not conceived unless the aggregates are present, just like fire is only conceived in reliance upon fuel. So they say, look, you don't have to have the same kind of fuel, but as long as some kind of fuel is present, then fire comes to exist. In this way, fire does exist, and it exists in dependence on the fuel. So there is a kind of causally conditioned existence of the fire, such that the fire is not permanent, it's not unchanging, it doesn't last forever. It only exists because fuel exists, right? And they say the self, or the personhood, is exactly the same way, such that a person only exists in reliance upon the aggregates. Doesn't have to be all the same kind of aggregates like I just mentioned, but there must be some aggregates, and therefore as long as those aggregates are there, we can say a person exists. This is meant to hit upon our intuitions, I think, in a similar way to what John Locke was trying to do in this idea of being conscious of our memories, conscious of previous states of consciousness, and associating them, right, as having some connection. Okay, so Vasubandhu is going to make two objections here. So he says, first, in terms of that metaphor, the Pulavadgavins are a bit wrong, because fire arises in dependence upon fuel. And when fuel becomes fire, it is actually different from fuel. So there is actually a substance that is not fuel that comes to exist. So yes, it is causally conditioned, but therefore it becomes something different from fuel. And we can't say it's just fuel. Where the Pulavadgavins want to say that the self is something other, right? It's not just the aggregates. It's something other than the aggregates, but it arises in dependence on the fuel. And so first Vasubandhu is going to say, you can't actually say that, right? Because it is something other than, fire is something other than fuel once it has been caused, right? Fuel transitions such that when it combusts, it is no longer fuel, it's something else. And if we want to say there's a self in the same way, then you would have to say the aggregates are no longer the aggregates, and they become the self. Secondly, if a person arises in the same way in dependence upon the aggregates, then they must be something other than the aggregates. So if we have to admit that fire is something different from fuel, then the self has to be something different from the aggregates. And in this way, you are then trying to say there is something that is distinct, that is the self, that is not the aggregates. You then have to explain what is the self. So I want to read here as Vasubandhu explains it. He says, the Pudgalavadins believe that they avoid these objections because they assert that fire is the heat present in the above-mentioned burning material, and that the fuel in reliance upon which fire is conceived is comprised of the three elements of earth, air, and water that conjointly arise with it in burning material. But according to this analysis, fire must still be other than fuel, since they will have different defining properties. Moreover, the meaning of in reliance upon must be explained, since, according to their analyses of fire and fuel, how is fire conceived in reliance upon fuel? For if the analyses are correct, it is true not only that fuel will not be a cause of fire, but also that it will not even be a cause of the conception of fire, since fire itself will be the cause of the conception of fire. If fuel were the cause of the conception of fire, then we wouldn't need fire to know that, we wouldn't need fire to know that fire exists. We would merely need fuel. That fuel would be fire if fuel is the cause of the conception of fire. But of course, fuel is not the cause of the conception of fire. It is only when fire exists, when fuel has combusted and turned into fire, that we can then say there is fire. If the meaning of in reliance upon, right? So, I mean, this is important as well. How exactly does if you want to say the self comes to exist independent on the aggregates, what is the process by which this occurs? So he says, if the meaning of in reliance upon is a support as inseparable concomitants, then the aggregates must also be said in the same way to be the supports or inseparable concomitants of a person, in which case they clearly must say that the aggregates are other than a person, since the supports and inseparable concomitants of something are other than it. And they must also say, contrary to their theory, that a person does not exist in dependence upon the existence of the aggregates, that a person does not, in fact, exist unless the aggregates exist, just as fire does not, in fact, exist unless fuel exists. Finally, What does hot signify in their earlier assertion that if fire were other than fuel, fuel and burning material would not be hot? If it signifies heat, then fuel itself is not hot, since it is, according to their analysis, what possesses the essences of the other three elements, rather than the essence of the fire, whose presence in something is the cause of its heat. There remains the possibility that what is hot, even if it is other than fire, which is hot according to its essence, can be shown to be hot in the sense that it can be combined with heat. But in this case, fire being other than fuel is not a problem for the view that fuel and burning material is hot. Should they say, in order to avoid the objection that fire is other than fuel, that burning material is as a whole both fire and fuel, they must explain what it can mean in this case to say that fire is conceived in reliance upon fuel. For if burning material is as a whole both fire and fuel, fuel will be the fire, and that in reliance upon which fire is conceived will be the fire itself, which the Pugalavedins deny. Moreover, since the aggregates themselves would also be the person, it follows that they could not avoid the theory that a person is not other than his aggregates. Therefore, they have not shown that a person is conceived in reliance upon the aggregates in the way in which they believe that fire is conceived in reliance upon fuel. So quite simply, what he's getting at is either it is the case that there is a thing that is a self that is not merely just the aggregates, but is a distinct substance that exists in dependence upon the aggregates. And in that case, you have to explain what exactly the self is. In this case, they don't want to say it is something independent of the aggregates, so that leaves us to have no other conception of the self than it is the aggregate, since it only exists in dependence upon the aggregates, that the self is a collection of the aggregates. If we want to say, though, on the other hand, that the self is not merely the aggregates and it exists in dependence upon the aggregates, then the fact that it is distinct means ultimately it has to be independent of the aggregates. If it is independent of the aggregates, then we are now talking about something like a soul, which is distinct in the sense of where a soul is immaterial and the body is material. So you have the question of how does immateriality come to interact with materiality? This is not explained at all by the Pugalavedins. And they don't want to accept that position. They don't want to say there is a real self that is independent of the aggregates, because then consciousness, volition, feeling, etc., all those actually are not relevant at all for the conception of the self. But they want to have something that appeals to our common intuition. The latter case, as I just mentioned, doesn't do that. The former case leaves us to end up saying that the self is just the collection of aggregates. The problem with that, again, is that you can have various aggregates that come and go. You don't have to have a body to be a self, right? I can have a tan, I can be more pale, I can have long hair, I can have no hair. All those things can change, and yet I can be a self. And if it is just merely the fact that I have those things that makes a self, then that doesn't explain how I am me, which is distinct from you, because we would all have at least some corporeality, some feeling, or otherwise. Now, in response, they say, every action depends on an agent. Consciousness is an action, therefore whoever is conscious must exist, right? So they want to take down and say, look, whatever the conception of the self is, it has to arise in dependence on the aggregates. And they give this very Cartesian account, right? That basically, because if we want to say that someone is conscious of something, that is an action, therefore there has to be someone that exists to have that conscious experience, right? Like thinking or doubting my own existence. But Vasubandhu responds to this by saying, what is referred to as a person in this case, that is the possessor of this consciousness, refers to various caused entities, not merely just some, pure action. He says, X person is no more than momentary caused entities that form an unbroken continuum. The walking of X person is like the propagation of sound or the spread of a fire. In the same way, thinking that the cause of consciousness is a unitary being, fools say that X person is consciousness. So again, back to the fire metaphor. If we think about a fire, let's say we have a bunch of sticks, right? And we see how when we light the first spark, right, we have a spark and the first flame is lit, the fire kind of spreads. Now, would we say that it is literally the exact same fire that grows, that it is one substance that persists over time, that grows over the fuel, over the pieces of wood, kindling, whatever else? No, of course not. We know that the fire, as it spreads, is merely new series of combustion, right? And that even when you have, let's say, a lighter, where it looks like a flame persists, right? It's I press on the lighter, the flame is continuing. That's not one flame that exists, right? It's constantly fuel being burned, turning into a flame, constantly coming in and out of existence, such that the cause of the current flame's existence is due to the fact that the previous piece of fuel was lit and then came out of existence, which gave room for the next piece of fuel to be lit, and so on, that carried the spark, right, that was needed to ignite the next series of fuel in this continuum. So there is no actual fire. There is no actual, for example, if we think about a light bulb, there is no actual light that just subsists over time, that is a thing. It's a series of, I don't know my physics enough about light bulbs, right? But perhaps photons, right? That are constantly, shooting out so fast. It seems like one constant stream of light that is one thing, but it's really not. It's an indefinite series of light rays, we could say. In the same way, this is what a person is. That when we talk about a person having consciousness and consciousness being in action, all we're actually talking about is a state of consciousness. But we're not talking about a substance that is a person that persists over time, that possesses this continuum of states of consciousness. So then the Buddhist opponent, the Pudgalavedens, or perhaps Locke, someone else, right? Descartes, responds to that, saying, if consciousness arises from a previous moment of consciousness and not from a soul, then why isn't it always qualitatively the same whenever it arises following a fixed order? That if consciousness is just this causal series of events, then why wouldn't we just say that it's always qualitatively the same? Because there's always going to be that same series of events, it seems like, that same chain of experiences. One experience causes the next experience, which causes the next experience, and so on. It would seem that our consciousness would never change in that case. So Vasubandhu responds to this by saying, all caused entities exhibit a state of constant change as a result of the myriad causes, such that a continuum necessarily varies from one moment to the next. So although, the way that I was speaking about the spread of fire was very simple, where you have just the previous flame which ignited the next flame and so on, there's really a whole myriad of causes, such that there is that previous flame, although perhaps it's multiple flames. There's oxygen, which is informing the way in which this next flame is going to come into existence. Perhaps there's too much oxygen, too little. This is going to affect perhaps the volume of the flame, and so on, right? This is exactly how consciousness works. We have all these various things that are influencing the arising of our conscious states, such that explains why, then, our conscious states change over time. Now, the Buddhist opponent, especially perhaps a Cartesian or someone else, who wants to insist there is a self which subsists over time. There is a real you. It is the soul. They might respond like this, that the self is the soul which bears a partial connection to the mind. Thus, different kinds of cognition occur according to the different mental states that arise from the conjunction of the soul and the mind. So in this way, they want to say, yes, right? We admit your states of consciousness change over time. But part of the reason your states of consciousness change over time has to do with the fact that, yes, we say it's not that the soul has complete control over the mind, right? The self is affected by environmental factors and so on, memories, trauma, etc. But there is still a role that the soul plays in the arising of different states of consciousness. But Vasubandhu responds to this by saying, if this is so, then the soul explains nothing. The explanation is like what a quack doctor does. He says, then why not say that the different cognitions arise directly from the different mental states? The soul has no explanatory role here at all. It's like a quack doctor who, having already given medicine sufficient to cure the disease, recites some magic syllables, Phuh, Amen. Right? As if it's really the quack doctor needs to say, Phuh, Amen, for the patient to actually be healed. When in fact, the doctor's already given the medicine that's going to heal the patient. In the same way, if the person wants to admit, yeah, our cognition is affected by various mental states that arise from environmental factors and so on, then what's the point of the soul? The soul doesn't explain anything. We already have an explanation if you admit that our consciousness, our volition, and so on, all these things that we say make up a self, are influenced by various causal factors, then we have no need for the soul. It explains nothing how we have a causal series of states of consciousness over time that we come to think of a self. Okay, one last objection by the opponent that Vasubandhu is going to respond to. So the opponent might then respond by saying, one ought to still adopt the existence of the soul, because since every property must be supported by a substance, memory cannot be linked with any substance but the soul, right? How can you explain the existence of memory? It seems like for memory to subsist over time, such that we can reflect on previous memories or previous states of consciousness, it must have some substance which provides support for its subsistence, something that kind of holds it throughout time, and that must be the soul. Vasubandhu responds to this by saying, there's no proof that mental states, like memory, require something else for their existence. A support is anything that enables an effect. Therefore, mental states and any other number of causes can enable the effect of memory. So, just as in the last case, we already have an explanation for how memory can persist over time, because it is influenced and it is made to arise in existence due to previous mental states, due to previous states of consciousness, due to previous states of volition, of judgment, and so on, that continue this causal series of events that are, in this case, memory. It is this persistent desire to think that there must be a soul in the face of explanations that explain why the soul doesn't have any explanatory role at all that causes suffering. And of course, for Buddhism, right, the main point is to overcome suffering. This is explained in the fact that the opponent might say, if there is no soul, then what is the meaning of the statements, for example, I am happy, or I am not happy? It seems like we understand what someone means when they say I'm happy or I'm not happy. It seems like they're referring to themselves. They're not just saying there's happiness or there's unhappiness. They're saying I am happy or I am unhappy, not you or just no one is happy or unhappy. So how do you explain those statements that we use all the time, Vasubandhu? He says, this expression is metaphorical, it's not literal. Because of people's affection for them, people of ordinary intellect come to believe, I am white, I am dark, I am fat, I am thin, I am old, I am young. They identify themselves with these things. Souls are not of this type, though. Therefore, the identification of the self has the aggregates as its object. So, of course, when we say I'm happy or I'm not happy, we're referring to some aspect of the aggregates. We already admitted the aggregates can't be the self because we don't necessarily need all the aggregates to think of ourselves as a self. So we already then don't require the existence of the soul to explain I am happy or I am not happy. And we already have explained, right, so all we need is the aggregates. We've already explained the aggregates can't be the self. So when people say I'm happy or I am not happy, they're actually thinking according to an illusion that there is a real self there that is or is not happy, that possesses happiness or does not possess happiness. But because there is no real self there, they're always going to be longing for the persistence of happiness for themselves, which of course is impossible because there is no self there that persists over time to be happy. So they're striving after something that is impossible to achieve. So how is it that we can explain all these different things? Like we can say, I am happy or I'm not happy, and yet there is no self. This has to do with the distinction between conventional and ultimate truth in Buddhism. So Buddhists argue that a statement is conventionally true if and only if it is acceptable to common sense and consistently leads to successful practice. So it is practical for me to refer to myself as Austin, right? It wouldn't make sense if I walked into a room and let's say I wanted to point out my friend and I was like, hey, look, there's my the causal series of aggregates over there, that's my friend. And you'd be like, which causal series of aggregates? So we just say that is perhaps Spencer over there, right? Even though there is no Spencer that subsists over time, right? There is just a causal series of aggregates that we take to be Spencer. But there really is no Spencer that is there, that exists over time. A statement is ultimately true if and only if it corresponds to the facts and neither asserts nor presupposes the existence of any conceptual fictions. And since the self was shown to be a conceptual fiction, then we can say it is ultimately true that there is no self, right? That we can say the name Austin is like a label, right? It's like a label we put on something because it works to act this way. But it doesn't work all the time. It doesn't work when I strive for happiness by thinking there's some true self, true Austin that I have to live up to, right? These desires cause suffering. So the conception of self refers only to a continuum of aggregates. As Vasubandhu says, whatever is the principal cause of an action, that is called the agent. And the soul has no causal efficacy at all. Therefore, the soul should not be considered an agent. From memory arises intention. From intention, thought. From thought, exertion. From exertion, a wind in the body. And from this wind comes the action. What does the soul do in this process? Nothing. We already have an explanation through a causal series of events that explains how we come to have thoughts, how we come to be, right? More accurately, we have a causal explanation for how there comes to be states of consciousness. But there are no states of consciousness that persist over time, because those states of consciousness come into existence and immediately flame out, giving rise to another state of consciousness, and so on. So there is no true self that is one. So the true self is not feeling, it is not volition, it is not merely consciousness, such that if you only had consciousness and you didn't have volition, judgment, feeling, corporeality, that we could say that that's truly you. It is not a combination. It's not that you really only need corporeality, judgment, and volition to be a self, to be Austin, myself, for example. I think that consciousness is very important for me to be me. It's not that you can have none of those things, because who would we even be referring to? We would have no basis for explaining who is who. It's not that you need all of those things, because, again, those things change over time. I can lose my arm and yet still be Austin. And we cannot say that, there is a self that is, of course, independent of the aggregates like the soul, because the soul has no explanatory process at all. So, the ultimate truth is that there is no self.